On today's World Insight, former U.S. President Jimmy Carter normalized China-U.S. relations. But what more lessons can the world learn from the former president in leadership, courage, and international diplomacy? An international expert provides the answers.
Hello and welcome to World Insight with me, Tian Wei. Jimmy Carter, who served as the 39th President of the United States from 1977 to 1981, passed away on December 29, 2024, at the age of 100. A state funeral was held in the U.S. Capitol on Thursday in honor of President Jimmy Carter. Now, China-U.S. relations remain a cornerstone of global stability, yet they are increasingly challenged by the shifting political dynamics. The question of how the two countries can manage their differences, foster cooperation, and address global challenges becomes ever more pressing. Now let's take a look with my latest interview with Stephen Orlins, President of the National Committee on U.S. China Relations. Thank you so much, Mr. Orlins, for joining us. First of all, what do you think the politicians today can learn from President Carter?
President Carter, in his death, brought together both parties and showcased what's great of America. That we saw seated in the front rows the 5 former living presidents of the United States, having campaigned against each other so strenuously over the last year. There they sat. We saw President-elect Trump seated next to President Obama, speaking very cordially. We saw President-elect Trump reach out and shake hands with his former Vice President Pence for, as far as I know, the first time they have spoken since President Trump left office on January 20th, 2021. So it was remarkable, and it demonstrated the strength of America. What we saw today was unity. What we saw today was President Carter's death bringing together both parties. We saw eulogies from President Ford, a Republican, and President Biden, obviously a Democrat. And it really reminded me of the great strength of America. I've always watched funerals for Chinese leaders, and I've always been amazed that all of the former leaders of China attend the funerals of the deceased leader. And that's what we saw in America today. It was remarkable. In the days when I was in the State Department, in the days before we established diplomatic relations with China, there was division in the United States and there was division in China about whether or not the two countries should move ahead. That Deng Xiaoping faced opposition within the Chinese leadership about whether or not China should establish diplomatic relations with the United States. And President Carter faced opposition within the United States. The Congress was firmly set against the United States establishing diplomatic relations with China. He didn't poll it. He didn't kind of put his finger in the wind and say, which way is the wind blowing? Should I establish diplomatic relations? He decided what was in the strategic interests of America. Deng Xiaoping decided what is in the strategic interests of China. And they made the decision to come to terms. Each side compromised, and we established diplomatic relations. And the result of that, now 45 years later, is peace in Asia. That over the last 45 years, as opposed to the decades and decades before that, when we almost had constant war in Asia, we've had peace in Asia. And that's a result of the vision of those two great leaders. So what I hope politicians learn today is it's the vision that counts, not necessarily the polling. The majority of people may not even agree with what that decision was. But in the end, the leaders need to decide what is in the strategic interests of each country, what is in the interests of the people. And I hope that leaders in China and the United States both follow the lessons of President Carter and Deng Xiaoping.
In many of the eulogies being delivered at the ceremony, we also hear quotes like this: keep the faith when it's most tested. Now, that also in a way applies to China-U.S. relations, since you are someone who has been working on this relationship for decades. So how much faith is still there from both sides? And what do you think it takes to have the faith at the time of critical juncture being tested?
It's the perfect day to ask that question, because it takes the vision and the strength of leaders like Deng Xiaoping and President Carter to kind of allow the relationship to deliver the benefits to the people of China and the people of the United States that a constructive relationship can deliver. So the lesson is crystal clear. And if you go back 10 years ago, I played Tianwei and interviewed President Carter for a full hour for the National Committee's China Town Hall. And the repeated theme of that conversation was we were right, despite the opposition that we encountered, despite the opposition that Deng Xiaoping encountered. We delivered peace and prosperity to the American people and the Chinese people. And that's what we need to do today.
But you see the consistency there. What does it take really to have figures like this, not only just political leadership, but also among all of us at the time of critical juncture, be able to be consistent and be faithful to the decisions that we make and committed to it still, despite of whatever. I mean, Mr. Orlins, that is something I have seen from you and your colleagues, but I do want to know, what does it take?
It is both top down and bottom up. So the top down I've discussed in the sense that it takes the leaders to recognize the benefits that can accrue to the people of the United States and the people of China from a constructive, productive U.S. China relationship. But it also requires that the people to kind of understand the benefits that flow from a positive relationship between the United States and China. And that's the job of CGTN, CCTV, ABC, CBS, NBC, CNN. It's the jobs of people in the media to obviously talk about the problems, but also talk about the benefits that can accrue from a beneficial U.S.-China relationship. And it has to be, top down and bottom up. The people need to decide. Ultimately, it's the people who direct the leaders what they want to do.
But on the other hand, Mr. Orlins, we also see, the important roles that business community plays, the important roles the academic community plays, and the list goes on. As long as they can speak up and they want to speak out, then the media will have materials to cook and to put together to present to the public. So it takes a whole layer of different communities together.
Yes, I agree with that. But what the governments need to do is create circumstances where businesses want to speak out. So both the Chinese and U.S. governments need to create environments where businesses can compete on a level playing field, make money, reward their shareholders, and want to speak out about U.S.-China relations. We need enough people-to-people exchanges to have the people on each side saying, gosh, isn't it great? Shouldn't we be closer to the Chinese people? And the Chinese people saying, isn't it great that we should be closer to the Americans? There's we need so many more American students to go to China. President Xi, when we hosted him in November
2023 in San Francisco,
he talked about getting 50,000 American students to China, and that's absolutely right. But that doesn't, even if we succeed in that, which I strongly hope we do, it's nothing compared to the 290,000 Chinese students in the United States. But in my view, the 290 is too few. We should have even more than that coming to the United States because the students, American students in China, Chinese students in the United States are ambassadors for the history, for the culture of each society in the other society.
Right.
So we need more and more people-to-people exchanges, but the people can do it, but the government has to create environments where it's easier to do.
Think about the latest, the young generation. They grow up with rhetorics around them talking bad about China and the United States toward one another. So this must have a tremendous impact on their perceptions about the other side. Which reminds me of an interesting analogy, maybe I can draw here, that you, as a young lawyer, back in the 1970s, worked in the State Department for the eventual result of establishing diplomatic relations between China and the United States. You also grew up at a time when there were tremendous negative rhetorics between China and the United States as a result of the Cold War. So how did your generation then adjust to that sudden change and twist of this relationship? And how do you think the young generation today can maybe draw some inspirations from then?
Ping pong diplomacy, which the National Committee hosted, played an incredibly important role in changing the perceptions both of Chinese of Americans and of Americans of Chinese. So in a way, how you would metaphorically ask the question is, okay, what's the ping pong diplomacy of 2025? How do we kind of change the attitudes of people on both sides? And now with the way media is today and so many different platforms, it's much, much more difficulty. You know, kind of I'm invited to a panda kind of party in Washington. So maybe they're saying, well, pandas are a little bit like ping pong. Pandas of 2025, like the ping pong of 1972. But that, you know, that's nice. It is certainly not sufficient. But what needs to happen is we need to see governments on both sides change lots of policies, which would ultimately lead to a better perception of America in China and of China in America. But unless that happens, I think we're going to be in for a rough ride.
Do you think it's already too late or not yet?
It's not too late.
Do you see some signs that would support your idea?
There is a bottom-up kind of making of policy. So the people's attitudes have to change. The people, both the Chinese people and the American people, are very smart. They each perceive the threats to themselves in a very similar way. I always make the analogy of a parent in Shanghai and a parent in New York. What they fear most are actually the same things. So I'm sitting here, I'm looking out at the Hudson River. I'm looking at this side at Wall Street, and I'm looking at the site of the 9/11 terrorist attack. And I think those three things in a lot of ways represent the same thing to a parent in Shanghai and a parent in New York. It's fear of the future for their children. Why do I talk about the Hudson River? Because it overflows its banks, just the way the Huangpu River would overflow its banks as a result of climate change. And that is an existential threat for our children and grandchildren. Why do I talk about 9/11? Because terrorism remains a threat in China, and it remains a threat in the United States. And why do I talk about Wall Street? Because that reminds me of economic prosperity. Is the child in Shanghai going to have more opportunity than her parents had? Is the child in New York going to have more opportunity than her parents had? These problems will only be solved jointly. They can't be solved separately. They may not be solved jointly, but we have no chance if we don't operate jointly. I think the people will, over time, as these circumstances continue to deteriorate, will recognize that, and they will be telling the leadership, shouldn't we be have a more cooperative relationship with China? And China, they'd be saying, shouldn't we have a more cooperative relationship with the United States? And ultimately, that push from below tells the leadership, we have to do the right thing. And then that gets back to President Carter, who understood, even though the polling told him not to do this, he understood that it was in the long-term interests of the American people. And Deng understood it was in the long-term interests of the Chinese people, and we need to make compromises to get it done. In my view, it's the confluence of those two, the bottom up and the top down, will allow the U.S. China relationship to flourish once again. I don't know if it's going to be next year, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, but it will be sometime.
Look at the China-U.S. relations. Even during the time before the normalization, there were almost 2 decades in the United States discussing about how should we seek a more constructive relations with China in a more strategically advantageous place for the United States during the Cold War. But it didn't happen until Nixon visited China. And the normalization since Nixon visit take another 7 years to be realized. So it seems that there are very incremental and kind of process that has to be there, Mr. Orlins.
I think that's right. That Nixon obviously was ideally suited to make this great new grand bargain with China, because he came from the anti-communist right wing of the Republican Party. So he, in effect, was inoculated from being attacked. I think today it's in the United States, it's much more bipartisan, that both parties are not particularly in favor of a constructive relationship with China. We're seeing in the final days of the Biden administration a raft of regulations and findings that are not helpful to the U.S., to the people of the United States, not helpful to U.S. China relations, but they're doing it. I think the right thing in this case would be to wait until President Trump took office and have him decide if he wants to put in place new regulations. It's unusual between an election and an inauguration that a president who is not going to remain in office puts out these regulations. So that, he's entitled to do it. It's not illegal, but it's not the tradition. So it's a bipartisan consensus. We need to be, quote, tougher on China, and China responds accordingly. And we've seen some good things. We saw the travel advisory on travel to China lowered from a level 3 to a level 2, which makes it easier for students and others to travel to China. So when I have a parent of a student going to China, they call and say, it says we should reconsider travel to China. Now it's 2 rather than 3. So they don't get fewer of those calls. So that's a benefit. Cooperation on fentanyl or precursors to fentanyl is a good thing. Our military's having conversation is a good thing. So at the final days of the Biden administration, we're seeing some tough rules coming out, and then we're seeing some progress on other things. So it's a very mixed picture.
And Mr. Orlins, I know there are a lot of people that are faithful about this relationship between China and the United States, one of the arguably most important bilateral relations in the world. And they are also working around the clock behind the scenes in order to make better things happen. On that, do you have anything to share with us, or what might be the best practices and the principles to hold right now, leading up to the...
We've already heard President-elect Trump talk about his good relationship with the president of China. That I have repeatedly said that it's the leaders that need to move the bureaucracy. It's very difficult for the bureaucracy to kind of make decisions on something as sensitive as U.S. China relations without the leaders speaking. So I've advocated having our leaders speak regularly. I've advocated having the American president go to China annually, the Chinese president go to America, come to America annually. And this apparently, it sounds like it's happening. I've also advocated for China. My first job in life after I left the State Department was helping U.S. companies invest in China.
Yes.
I believe that became an enormous benefit to people relations, that those initial investors were ambassadors for American culture, values, history in China, and the people we work with became much more pro-constructive U.S. China relations than others. Now, decades later, Chinese investment in the United States does the same. Now, what's happened over the last few years, it peaked and now it's kind of going way down. I get the sense that President Trump is going to be more welcoming to Chinese investment in the United States than the previous administration. That he believes that the creation of jobs in the United States by Chinese enterprises is great. And if they're going to invest over more than $1 billion, he's already stated he will make issuing of permits more easy. It'll be easier for them to get it. So I have a feeling that that may be an area where we see improvement. I think tariffs, there's little that we can do. There will be tariffs. I don't know that the percentage of the tariffs, whether it's going to be 20, 30, 40, 50, 60%, but it will be significant, and it will create trade diversion. So some of the things which the United States previously bought from China will be bought from elsewhere, or may even be produced in the United States. I think it's very useful if the Chinese early on import more energy from the United States, import more agricultural products from the United States, import more airplanes from the United States. Boeing it's got a huge number of undelivered airplanes that are destined for China. And these can kind of lower the bilateral deficit, which will be, the President-elect Trump cares a lot about that. So there are things that can be done which can make the relationship more constructive. I think the Chinese government should not be passive, that they should start to do some of these things to signal that they're prepared to have a more constructive relationship. And in the trade area, that is very important.
Consensus in China has been building about more policies for opening up, about turning the economy more toward structural reform and implement them. So from a rich knowledge background about China, how do you think all of these things put together might also help to a certain extent with the constructive relationship between China and the United States in the future?
I think structural reform in China will be extremely beneficial to a constructive U.S.-China relationship. It's something which, if you go all the way back to 2017, 18, when the first Trump administration was negotiating what was called the Phase 1 trade agreement, the Phase 2 trade agreement was going to have a lot of structural reform in it. And that would be beneficial because it would give U.S. companies a level playing field, not to be disadvantaged by state-owned enterprises, not to be disadvantaged by a structure which favors domestic products over international products. So I think that would be a great first step. And if China is going to do that, they certainly should very early on go and see our secretaries of the Treasury, Commerce, and State and explain what they're planning on doing. Because I think it's what I've advocated in my speeches. I think it not only benefits U.S.-China relations, it benefits the Chinese people. The Chinese people have more selections of goods and more ability to earn money if structural reform occurs. So I think that would be a great first step.
All right. You always use a famous quote coming from Mao Zedong, the late Chinese chairman, in describing how much confidence we still have about our way forward despite of difficulties. I really wonder, how are we going to wrap up today's conversation? The same quote or something else, given the circumstances?
在困难的时候看到成绩，看到光明，提高我们的勇气。I think it's pretty good for today.
Yeah.
I think we're potentially going to head into a difficult period, but we do have to look at our record. We do have to look, Tianwei, I'm old, that I was around during the war in Vietnam. I was around during when American soldiers were dying and Chinese soldiers were dying in the Pacific. And we should remember that since we established diplomatic relations, almost nobody has died. I mean, it's been a death or two. And that's a product of a constructive U.S. China relationship. I think, the 提高我们的勇气, I think there's going to be criticism from both sides for standing up for constructive U.S. China relationship. And I think you got to be brave. You have to just stand up and say, okay, criticize me. But, I'm confident because even if I'm a minority, I'm confident because I like the people who agree with me. I think if I'm going to fight a war, I want those people to be, my comrades in arms. I think that's terrific. It's not the first time I've been a political minority. And last but not least is I'm sure I'm right. I'm absolutely certain that a constructive U.S.-China relationship benefits the people of the United States and the people of China. So I'll keep doing what I'm doing.
Do the right thing, as they say.
Do the right thing.
Stephen Orlins, thank you so much, sir, as always.
Great to see you.
That's my latest interview with Stephen Orlins, president of the National Committee on U.S. China Relations. That's all the time we have for today. If you'd like to know more, search World Insight, check out our YouTube channel, follow us on X and Facebook. I'm Tian Wei on behalf of the team. Thanks for being with us. Bye for now.